Engineers Ireland membership delivers with our extensive online resource centre. Engage today and make the most of your Engineers Ireland membership. Building in highly dense city sites is not easy.
Getting concrete trucks into the city centre location in the middle of the day during business hours was very challenging. We used Stephen's Green as a holding area in consultation with the Gardaí for our concrete trucks.
Hello, my name is Dusty Rhodes and you're welcome to Amplified, the Engineers Journal podcast. Today we're discovering some of the challenges of working in highly dense areas, usually in highly crowded city centres. Our guest has quite some experience in this area. Since joining PJ Hegarty as a graduate in 1996, he's worked across several sectors, from pharmaceutical to semiconductor and city centre, commercial to retail and PPP bids as well. It's a pleasure to welcome to the show PJ Hegarty Regional Director John Gavigan. How are you, John?
I'm good. Good afternoon, Dusty. Glad to be here.
I always start by asking people what sparked your interest into getting into engineering?
Well, I grew up on a farm and there was always a little bit of concrete to be mixed, be it for standing a gate post or doing bits and pieces of repair work around the place. So there was a natural kind of progression. I liked studying the science subjects and mathematics at school, and kind of indicated from my chat with my career guidance teacher that engineering might be a good route, and ended up studying engineering and getting a job in the construction side of the industry, and kept going for nearly 30 years now.
It sounds like you were kind of like you just fell into it by accident, no huge draw for it, but you are still in the business 30 years later. So what do you find fulfilling about the work?
Yes, that would be fair. It wasn't something that I wanted to do and was clear in my destination from a young age. But since working with PJ Hegarty, I found that there are a wide range of diverse projects out there, and every project is different insofar as every project will have its own specific challenges, and the challenges are the things that you remember. You know, one reinforced concrete frame building or one steel frame building might be the same as the next, but it's the nuances that you remember that keeps it interesting. It's been said to me that to be a good project manager, you have to have knowledge that's a mile wide and an inch deep. So it's fairly diverse, the scope of knowledge that you have to have. Things from, like I said, concrete and steel and pure engineering, right down to the finishing of a job, ceiling tiles, ceiling finishes, tiles, carpets, all of that type of stuff. So it's fairly broad.
So you say a lot of jobs are, I don't want to say standard, but you're able to handle kind of most of the work. But there are occasional jobs that are extra challenging. Any particular ones that pop into mind?
Yeah, I remember the downturn in kind of 2009, 2010. There was much work going on in 2010 for the following years afterwards, and we won a project on Molesworth Street. It was the old passport office, and the job entailed demolition of the existing structure and deepening the basement. There was already a 2-story basement there. We had to construct a 3rd story, all of which had to be done in a live city centre setting, immediately adjacent to a Georgian building built in the 1700s, and we had to excavate 11 metres below that, unaware of what footings were built in the 1700s, and we had to make sure that everything was carried out safely, obviously.
I know the building you mean on 10 Molesworth Street, because I remember getting my first passport from there. But what kind of like rules and regulations and planning and everything do you have to go through when you are building a modern building besides something that's 200 years old?
The standard way of ensuring that you can excavate a basement safely is to install a secant pile wall around the full perimeter, which basically means you're coring down with a large 70-ton machine and placing a column of concrete 10, 12, 14 metres, and you're reinforcing every second pile with a reinforcing steel cage to give it the strength to withstand the pressure of the soil and the traffic driving by in the adjacent street. So that allows you to excavate without the risk of either the soil collapsing in on top, or in the case of the Georgian building being undermined and settling and cracking and having failure start. Now, where you have buildings immediately adjacent to an excavation for a basement, you would carry out an extra level of assessment. We engaged a specialist design engineer with experience in temporary works design like this. So in addition to the seek and pile wall, we put in a considerable amount of extra thought and effort and concrete underpinning, and also raking steel anchors, which are basically steel rods drilled in at typically 45 degrees and grouted in place with a weak concrete mix, a cementitious grout, to give extra hold and extra strength to the ground and to ensure that there's no slippage. And obviously you can imagine a 1700s building, if there's any sort of movement at all, you're potentially going to get serious cracks or even worse, catastrophic failure.
Now, somebody came up with the design creative for the building and the plans for that. And then when you eventually arrive on site and you see all of these problems that you have to solve, did that change the initial design at all?
Subtly, yes. Typically, we inherit a design and we build it. But we do advise on ways to improve the project for all parties involved. And if there is a way that the design can be subtly changed to make it easier or better, then we do that. I mean, there was quite a large concrete slab in the basement. Getting concrete trucks into the city centre location in the middle of the day during business hours was very challenging. It was designed with several slab pours in mind, because typically the size of the slab is determined by how quickly you can get the concrete deliveries to the site. So we discussed with the consultant about increasing the slab pour sizes. The reinforcing was amended to suit, and we had bigger pours as it happens. We chose to do them at night time. So we used Stephen's Green as a holding area in consultation with the Gardaí for our concrete trucks. We brought them down with traffic marshals as needed, and we had three stations set up to pump the concrete from around the perimeter of Molesworth Street, Satanta Place and Frederick Street, for anyone that knows the area. So we had three angles of attack, whereas that just wouldn't be possible during business hours.
It sounds like an organisational nightmare. Was it okay dealing with the various authorities to be able to close off streets and to get the trucks in?
Yes, Dublin City Council or the local authority, and any work outside of hours had to be done with their approval. Permits were generally issued. It was a requirement that we consulted with neighbours. We did have a good relationship with the neighbours. We engaged with them from very early on in that project. In fact, I can remember the very first Christmas that we were there, myself and two of my colleagues, and we spent 2 afternoons knocking on doors and shaking hands and actually meeting people. We handed over our contact information, and I have to say, we didn't get any spurious complaints. We did get a number of inquiries over the course of the project. I mean, the project was three years. We made some good friends. We got to know a few people. We didn't always have the answer or the explanation that the neighbours wanted, but I think they always understood, and we certainly had. We left there with no complaints, and it worked very well. The local authority wouldn't tend to issue permits for subsequent out-of-hours work if you didn't comply with their conditions for the early one. So that worked very well.
There's an awful lot of development going down, or there has been in the last certainly 10, 15 years in the Dawson Street area. I know that developing the corner of Dawson Street, just at Trinity College, at the bottom of Dawson Street. From your experience, when you were literally in the beating heart of the city centre, what are the biggest challenges in the project for you, working in that dense area?
It's the logistics of getting material in and out. Most of the workforce are accustomed to starting early, so it's not unusual to have 100 guys at the site for 7 a.m. The key to servicing the project is getting deliveries in early ahead of the traffic. So they would often be in, especially if they're coming from overseas, or particularly challenging logistic deliveries that required the big trucks, the big Arctic 13-metre trucks, or even longer if there are specialist items. That has to be brought in early. If there's any traffic movement, it has to be managed with traffic marshals at the periphery of the site. Any interaction with pedestrians or public traffic really has to be managed by typically 2 or 3 specialist trained traffic marshals. So the experience of those guys is really what we rely on. It's knowing how to judge when there's an opportunity. It's professionally designed by a traffic management consultant, and the plan and the vehicle movements will all be tracked with software to verify that where we design for a pull-in area will actually work. So there is science behind it, and then the local authority then have to issue their permits for these pull-in areas if they take up footpath areas or whatever. So it's something that is thought out. That is the key to it. Building is typically easy. It's as easy to build in a greenfield site 5 miles outside of the city centre as it is in the city centre, but it's getting the material and servicing it is the key.
What lesson did you learn from that project that you would apply to future developments?
Well, that's an interesting question. The project immediately after that actually was an equally challenging one. It was an office development on the Quays, and it was more challenging insofar as it only had one entrance, a narrow entrance immediately off the Quays. So while Molesworth Street was very busy on 3 sides, had 3 busy rows were on 3 sides of it, this one on the Quays only had, in fact, one entrance to it. So the logistics challenges and tricks that we had learned on Molesworth Street were useful in the follow-up project immediately afterwards.
Are you talking about the tropical fruit warehouse, are you?
That's right, yeah.
That's a gore. I mean, for people who don't know it, it's a beautiful red brick building, I believe from the late 1890s. And it contrasts. What I love about it is when you're walking across the Samuel Beckett Bridge, you see this beautiful old red brick building, and then it's just surrounded by modern glass, left, right, and centre. But getting into that site was particularly hard for you because it was only the one entrance. So what did you learn then from Molesworth Street that you were able to apply then with the tropical fruit warehouse?
Yeah, it's been able to have the same guys that were managing the traffic. One team moved from one job to the next, and it's a matter of making sure that we had the guys that knew how to deal with it. Very challenging, and everything had to be scheduled to within an inch of its life. It was all look aheads, daily coordination to make sure that deliveries arrived. If deliveries didn't arrive on time and they missed a slot by a few minutes, then unfortunately they had to reschedule.
From the sounds of it, it's the logistics of getting everything to the site. But once everything is there, construction goes on as usual. I can imagine with a nice, I'm going to call it a simple construction where you have a space and you're putting up a building. But with the tropical fruit warehouse, you have to keep the original building from the 1890s and build over and around and behind it. That must have presented some unique construction challenges for you.
It sure did. I mean, as you've described it there, is pretty accurate. So it's an existing 2-story warehouse. It had a slated roof on timber trusses. The original timber trusses were there from the 1800s. They typically a 14-metre span or thereabouts. The timber trusses themselves had evidence of a lot of decay at the ends of them. I think 12 of the 30 trusses required significant refurbishment. So the roof was stripped, the slates were all stored and salvaged for reuse, and the timber trusses were taken carefully off-site and sent for refurbishment, where the ends where there was decay present were removed, all the joints were tested and refurbished, and a special splice detail, a timber resin splice, was installed to replace the bearing ends where the timber had decayed. And that was actually carried out with timber that was salvaged from an old church in Leeds in Yorkshire. So the specialist company that we used this recycled salvaged timber because modern timber wouldn't have the same engineering properties as fully seasoned timber that had been used in a similar application. So that was the roof part of it. Once the roof was taken off, we had to construct a 6-story new reinforced concrete core. And that was one of the concrete towers that you'll see poured around a typical project in the city centre. But what was different then was we constructed a 2-story steel frame that was basically hanging off this central core. So it's a cantilevered steel structure, 4 and 5 floors plus a plant room on top for the 6th floor. So in order to safely construct a hanging steel frame, we basically had to build it up from the ground. So we built a 6-story steel structure, but when it was complete, then removed floors 1 to 3 inclusive below, if that makes sense. So we had to build it up to support it. And then when the permanent connections were in place, we controlled the removal of the temporary steel frame underneath it, which was 3 stories.
Did you have the confidence to know that when you removed it, everything would still remain standing? Or was there a little bit of you going, ugh?
Well, look, I mean, there was so much attention given to that. There was never any concern that anything was going to go significantly wrong, but we were obviously concerned that everything went 100% right. As it happened, it did. I mean, there was a whole series of transfer of weight. So if you can imagine the propping steel, the temporary steel removed from the permanent structure, initially you're going to get a sagging under the self-weight of the steel frame when you remove the temporary support. So it is going to sag. The next stage was we poured concrete slabs, and that's going to introduce yet further settlement, extra weight, and then the not insignificant weight of the glass cladding on the facade is going to introduce more weight and more deflection. So at each of those 3 stages, we measured deflection to verify that the structure was doing what it was supposed to do. The consultant who designed the steel frame had included predicted deflections for each of these stages, and we monitored them, and they were all within the expected range, thankfully.
Do you remember what the deflection was?
It would have been 25 millimeters, and slightly over that in some instances. I mean, there's quite a significant distance from the point of support to the edge of the structure. The cantilever was 14 meters, I think, at its highest point.
We'll return to our podcast in just a few seconds, but first a reminder that Engineers Ireland membership delivers with our wide-ranging career supports. Engage today and make the most of your Engineers Ireland membership. Working with the Tropical Fruit Warehouse and with 10 Molesworth Street, you are working with very, very old buildings beside, brand new modern constructions. How do modern building codes and regulations work with such old buildings? It's like you were talking about the roof and the struts and everything. Do you have to maintain the originals?
That's a very interesting question, and that's something that we discussed at length at the start of the project, because, and you've actually hit the nail on the head there with the timber trusses. So the timber trusses were 1870s. We know they were fit for purpose because they've been supporting the roof for the last 100 and whatever it is, well over 100 years. Yet when we took them off, refurbished them and put them back on, the designer is responsible for certifying that they can withstand the future loads and comply with modern building codes. So in order to do that, initially it was thought, well, there's a lot of iron fittings, wrought iron fittings connecting the various node points of the timber trusses. Like I said, these timber trusses were over a ton weight, 14-meter span, 8 feet high or thereabouts, lots of interconnecting struts and different timber sections and compression and tension, and lots happening at all the joints. So that the engineer responsible for the design and certifying it wanted to be satisfied that the timber was sound and the metal fittings were sound. So one way of doing that is to dismantle the fittings and the joints, carry out analysis of the timber to check for its presence of rot, make sure the fibers are all in good condition, the timber is performing well, carry out x-rays of the metal fittings to make sure there's no micro cracks and future potential for failure. But the specialists advised, guys, if we do that, we're likely to damage a lot of the fittings and possibly the timber, and the chances of being able to reinstate using the initial materials is slim. You're looking at potentially more than half of the joints having to be redone, which goes against the conservation ethos of the project. And there's other complications as well, like costing more money, which is often the consideration point. But in order to satisfy ourselves, there was quite an innovative testing regime set up. None of the people involved in the project had come across it before. It came from a specialist consultant from the UK who was working with the refurbishment contractor that we were using. And without going into it in too much detail, it was a dynamic loading rig was set up, and a sample number of the trusses were put through their courses with loading to mimic the permanent scheme. And all of the trusses that were tested were found to be well capable of carrying the load that they'd be subjected to. Much better performing than if they were designed for new. Modern trusses will be designed to perform much more efficiently. There's a lot more redundancy, a lot more spare capacity in these trusses. So there was a lot of effort went into checking and making sure that all the trusses were performing well, and a good sample of them were load tested, and that got us over the line. So that means that everybody can sleep at night knowing that the structure is performing and will comply with modern building codes.
With the Tropical Fruit Warehouse and again with Molesworth Street and the Georgian buildings there, did you ever sit back and consider the work that some other engineer had done on that site 200 years ago?
Yes. I mean, that Tropical Fruit Warehouse, when we took possession of the site, there was an old masonry wall that had a significant buildup of whitewash, or at least white paint, over the years. We removed that as part of the scope to clean it up and expose the masonry. And it became evident that this was an historic wall from an even older building. On the site of the Tropical Fruit Warehouse, there had been the Hibernian school that was used to educate orphan children of sailors who had perished at sea, and it was built in the 1700s. So there was quite a sizable chunk of this wall had been used as the external wall of the warehouse that was built 100 years later in the 1800s. So this was worth saving. So when this was discovered, the project was actually redesigned, went back for revised planning, where this wall was made a feature of. Fabulous wall, about 20 meters long, had a few of the windows and door openings were still evident in them. They had been blocked up with modern blockwork, so they were cleared out, opened up again, and new suitable windows were put in as part of the conservation effort, and this was exposed. So yes, I did often think, chatting with our own crew there, do you think there's anything that we're building now is going to be refurbished in 100, 150 years' time? Probably not.
Let me ask you about your mind space about something that engineers of 200 years ago today, and I'm sure in 200 years' time, the impact of deadlines and budget changes and all that kind of stuff, where when you're hit with, that's going to add another 6 months onto a project, or that's going to cost us an extra 250, 500 grand on the project build. How do you handle it? Do you sit back and are you a very cool person and kind of go, all right, we'll work through it, or do you panic?
Try not to panic, that's for sure. As an engineer who has kind of evolved as a project manager in my career, you learn different problem solving techniques. You develop analytical skills where you can assess a different problem. In many ways, that's, an engineer solves problems. That's a lot of what we do.
And I think that's probably what I'm asking you, John, is kind of what is your problem solving thing? Like, when you're hit with something, do you have a process of how you handle that?
Well, I won't give you away all of my secrets.
Just one.
Look, I mean, when we're managing a project, there's 100 or 200 people will be on those sites that I've just described there. So my number one responsibility as the site lead is to make sure that all of those people go home safely at the end of every day, and that's not to be understated. Like, there's huge heavy equipment. There is a lot of potential hazardous activity goes on to build a 40, 50, 60 million euro project in the city centre. As I mentioned, there's a lot of vehicular movement. There's a lot of kit going on. That has to be the primary concern. Coupled with that responsibility, you need to deliver the project on time. That can never supersede the importance of doing it safely. So in fairness to the industry and the client base and the consultant base that we would deal with, there is generally an understanding of that. I mean, there is an understanding of that. So that's a given. How do you improve a project when there's something new, some curveball gets sent to you that requires extra time? You can put additional resources on the project. You can work longer hours. You can start doing night shifts if needs be. There are ways and means. Typically, it's additional resources, but that's not always straightforward. The best answer I would have to avoid that situation is communication and lots of planning and lots of discussion to make sure that any changes can be incorporated. There's lots of knowledge and lots of skill in the industry. If something is landed on you, you've no time to think, then that's when problems arise. But if there's communication across all the stakeholders, it's generally possible to find the solution. The other element of every project you have to consider, as you mentioned, is the commercial side of it. That generally happens. And one of my ex-bosses once told me, he said, people will always remember if there was a serious accident on the site. People will always see the quality of a job when it's finished, because it's there for years after. He said people generally, only a very few people will know if a project has made money or not, if it's commercially successful. And he said people will forget if it was a few weeks or a month late. The most important elements of a job are safety and producing a good quality, because people will be walking by the front door of it for years to come and will always see what it looks like. So I've always remembered that, and I think there's a fair amount of truth in that.
Well, listen, on that scale, and that's great advice you've got. Is there a piece of career advice that you wish that you had received earlier, that you could now impart?
Well, if somebody was to come to me and ask me about a potential career in the construction industry, I would definitely promote it. As I mentioned earlier, it's very diverse. There's no such thing as ever having a boring day. Like I mentioned there, every project has its challenges. The timber trusses on the roof and on the quays. There's a triple basement excavation with the special attention to another Georgian building. There's the cantilevered controlled deflection of a 2-story steel frame up at 4th and 5th stories. They're things that definitely take the potential for boredom out of your day. There's never a dull moment. Every project is different, and every project is effectively like a new job. So if you're working with a group of people and things are going well, that's great. But there's always difficulties. There's light at the end of the tunnel. Most projects are only on site for 12 to 18 months. I would encourage anybody coming to the industry to do what they like, study something that you like. And if that takes you down the construction route, then great. I mean, there are opportunities to work in design, work for a consultant, work for a building contractor, and you can specialize in any number of areas. Sustainability is a continually growing part of the industry, and we've a lot of people, we've a full team of people working in that, whereas 10 years ago, that was a relatively new part of the industry. So there's lots to do.
Very true, very true. If you'd like to find out more about John and some of the topics that we spoke about today, you'll find notes and links in the description area of the podcast. I'll make sure to include photos and links to the 2 projects we were talking about, which is 10 Molesworth Street and also the Tropical Fruit Warehouse that we were talking about earlier as well. But for now, John Gavigan, Regional Director of PJ Hegarty, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thank you very much.
If you enjoyed our podcast today, do share with a friend in the business. Just tell them to search for Engineers Ireland Amplified in their podcast player. The podcast is produced by justpod.io for Engineers Ireland. For advanced episodes and more information on career development opportunities, there are libraries of information on the website at engineersireland.ie. Until next time, from myself, Dusty Rhodes, thank you very much for listening. Engineers Ireland membership delivers with access to the exclusive EBSCO library. Engage today and make the most of your Engineers Ireland membership.